Hello everyone, welcome to my Evil Within, Akumu difficulty, no upgrade / keys walkthrough, and this is chapter 2, Remnants. And this is the point in the game where we're going to be getting into some actual combat, but we currently don't have any weapon at our disposal because we lost the pistol in chapter 1, and we have to get it back, and we'll be getting it back in a few minutes. And there's also going to be some hidden locations for some items, as you saw right there where I managed to get that match. And the matches are one of the coolest design choices in this game. They will allow you to use dead bodies as traps for the enemies, and you'll be able to clear out so many enemies if you time them perfectly, and you group them up together. And I've never heard of a game allowing you to use dead bodies as traps like that. And this once again showcases Shinji Mikami's unique take on gameplay that makes his games stand out so greatly. But we now have access to the lantern, and we will be getting the revolver, and we're going to be using the revolver to kill Connelly. And Connelly is not reflective of how the Haunted behave on this game. He's just there to be an introductory enemy. So, he moves very slowly, and he never tries to rush you. But he still has the exact same attacks as the Haunted, so you've got to be very careful. But this sequence right here is a massive homage to Resident Evil 1, since Shinji Mikami developed that game. Where you stood behind a zombie, he was feasting on the corpse, and he took the head off the corpse, and the head fell off like that. And then he turned to look at you like this. This very scene started survival horror, since Resident Evil 1 was the very first survival horror game ever made. But all we gotta do is run to the side once Connelly decides to lunge at us, and we're just going to shoot him in the head. If you get any moments where your reticle is perfectly on Connelly's head, but you end up missing, just know it's not your fault, because the revolver and the magnum on this game have this really weird property where for some reason the bullet can fire outside of the reticle, and it's one of the most baffling design choices in this game, and I'm so glad the Evil Within 2 doesn't have this system. It just leads you to develop a certain level of distrust with the reticle on this game, and you end up wasting ammo when you shouldn't. And in a survival horror game, the only time you should ever waste ammo is if you yourself aren't being skillful with shooting your weapons. So when the game decides to take that control away from you by utilizing a random variable that you have no control over, it just seems so counterintuitive to the survival horror aspect of the game. And the strangest thing about the random variable is that it's not moderated at all by the accuracy upgrade on the weapon. You can have a completely upgraded accuracy stat for your weapon, and you will still get screwed by the random variable. And I just don't think it's intentional whatsoever. I just think it's a big problem with the game. But they just haven't tried to fix it since this game is very old at this point. But I guess they managed to fix this issue in the Evil Within 2 somehow. But that I'll never understand. Or actually, no. The Kidman DLCs for this game, they didn't have that kind of issue. The M1911 on those DLCs was very accurate. The bullet would always fire within the reticle, and you never had any moments where the bullet would fire outside the reticle. So, somehow, during the development of those DLCs, they somehow figured out about this issue with the bullet firing outside the reticle, and they fixed it. And this might be the case because John Johannes directed the DLCs and not Shinji Mikami. So maybe John Johannes ended up fixing this issue somehow. But I guess that's why the Evil Within 2 didn't have this issue, because John Johannes developed the Evil Within 2 as well. But we have just done a sneak kill on that enemy, and there's also a goddess statue right there, which has a key. I just picked him up just for the heck of it. I'm not going to use the keys whatsoever, since this is a no-key run as well. But sneak killing enemies on this game. The stealth on this game is pretty good. On Akumu difficulty, you have to be careful though, because the enemies can hear you from greater distances, and that's why you've got to crouch behind an enemy very early, as you're about to see with this first enemy right here. I always take out this guy first, and then I take out the second guy on the right. And this guy will always do this looking cycle twice before he decides to move. And I'm just going to get behind him. On the Evil Within 2, you didn't have to be crouched to do sneak kills. On this game, you do. So you have to hold R1 and press X to do sneak kills. If you decide to uncrouch, the enemies can hear you when you uncrouch. But that's not the case with the Evil Within 2. So you've got to bear that in mind when it comes to this game. And I'm not going to waste time trying to sneak kill this guy. I'm just going to do a mechanic that Shinji Mikami developed, and only his games have this mechanic. This was in Resident Evil 4, this was in Resident Evil 5. I mean, Shinji Mikami didn't develop Resident Evil 5 and 6 though. And this was in the Evil Within and Evil Within 2. But if you shoot the enemies in the leg while they're in a neutral state of running, they will always get knocked over. That right there is the definition of realistic feedback. That is how bullets are supposed to work in real life. You ever heard of Newton's first law? An object in motion will always stay in motion? Well, that's what I just demonstrated just then. And you'll notice that I specifically mentioned you have to shoot them during a neutral state of running. And what I mean by this is that when the enemies are trying to run towards you, they have to do this startup animation before they actually go into a neutral state of running where they're just moving at a constant velocity. If you shoot them during the startup animation, they will not get knocked over. So if you're getting any moments where the enemies aren't falling down after being shot in the leg, it's for that reason. I mean, this system works exactly the same as it does in Resident Evil 4, only in Resident Evil 4, the enemies didn't have any kind of startup animation to initiate their sprint. They immediately transitioned into a neutral state of running, which is why the mechanics worked really well. And Resident Evil 5 did have this kind of startup animation for the enemies, only the mechanics still worked regardless of whether you shot them in the startup animation or not. So it seems kind of odd that they would somehow miss this kind of problem, but it's not that big of a deal. Just make sure you're timing your shots perfectly and you'll be fine. And there is another exception to this rule of getting enemies to fall over after getting shot. There's an attack that the enemies do where they will hold out their arms and run towards you, and it's a running grab. And the running grab has some really weird properties where for some reason the enemies will not flinch. And they won't flinch from anything. They will not flinch from a handgun, they will not flinch from a shotgun, they will not flinch from a rifle, they will not flinch from a magnum. They will just run through your bullets, and even if you shoot them in the leg, it will still not work. I mean, I have had a couple of moments where this has worked, but just to proceed with a bit of caution, always assume that they're going to hyper armor through your hits, and just deal with them accordingly. But we now have this pretty lengthy stealth encounter, which is a lot of fun, and on Akumu difficulty, you have to bear in mind that the enemy placements are different, and they've also added new traps as well. So, on this sequence on Akumu difficulty, there are a couple of bear traps, and there are also some wire traps. And it's definitely important that you disarm the traps, because on this game, when you disarm traps, you can use them as a crafting resource in order to make ammunition for the Agony crossbow, and there's no limit to how much you can carry. You know, there's a limit to how many bullets you're allowed to carry for certain weapons, but with the Agony crossbow, you have no limit to how many trap parts you're allowed to have. And the fact that you have no limit as to how many trap parts you're allowed to have means that you're going to be able to prepare yourself highly for so many of the sections coming up. There are a lot of sections on this game that really demand you use the Agony crossbow intelligently. And there's even a chapter in this game that allows you to amass so many trap parts from just one single section, and that's in chapter 7. But I'll get to that when I get to that chapter. Now right here, I intentionally turned on my lantern while I was disarming that trap so I could make myself more noticeable to the enemies. And when they spot me, I'm going to run back to this spot, and they're going to lose me. And when they lose me, they're going to just go back to where they just were. And during this time, I'm going to sneak kill them. And something you gotta bear in mind when you're trying to sneak up on enemies, you have to make sure you're approaching from the right-hand side of where they are, because if you decide to get behind them and you're kind of more to the left, they will do this left-hand glance that will allow them to see you. So you have to keep that in mind when you're trying to sneak up on these enemies. And I'm going to repeat the process once again with this enemy, and he spots me. And this is good. And one cool thing to note is that when an enemy spots you, they will not alert other enemies. This isn't Metal Gear Solid 1, where everyone just knows where you are when one person spots you. So you can safely isolate these enemies from the group. This kind of trick does not work on the Evil Within 2, because on that game, the enemies have the ability to roar, and that will alert other enemies. It's not always guaranteed that they will roar. There are times when they don't do the roar, and they will just go after you by themselves. But if they roar, it's pretty dangerous. Although the last known position mechanic on the Evil Within 2 is so powerful. Last known position mechanic on this game isn't really that good, because the enemies still kind of know where you are for a few seconds after you break line of sight. So you have to move quite a distance away from them before they decide to just stop following you entirely. And right here, you'll notice that I have a bottle. The bottles on this game are very useful for distracting enemies, but one cool thing that this game allows you to do with the bottles is if you throw a bottle at an enemy's head, they will go into a flinch animation that you can punish with a sneak kill animation. So if you hit them in the head with a bottle, and you go up to them and press R1 and X at the same time, Sebastian will jab his knife into the enemy's head and instantly kill it. And it's such a cool idea. That just seems like the kind of thing a normal individual would do. You know, the enemy's opened up, why not just stab him in the head and just save your ammo? Like, there's a lot of ways of saving your ammo on this game, and it's so beneficial. Punishing flinch animations with an animation just seems like a Shinji Mikami thing, and it perfectly suited Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 because you were fighting so many different enemies that you needed something like that in order to save your ammunition and to just control the hordes. Whereas in this game, you're not encountering that many enemies, and while you don't have the advantage of using such animations to deal with the enemies, you have the advantage of really powerful weapons like the shotgun. just the whole idea of executing an enemy with a knife just seems perfectly suitable for a character like Sebastian, who doesn't really have the exact same skill sets that Leon and Chris have in their respective games. And Sebastian's version of punishing flinch animations with an animation is simply a more grounded version of what Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 introduced with their whole system of punishing flinch animations with an animation. So, I think it just accommodates the survival horror aspect perfectly. And imagine if Leon and Claire knew such a system in Resident Evil 2. They wouldn't be struggling against the zombies. They could just shoot the zombies once in the head and then just punish them with a knife. But sadly, logic just didn't seem to apply to those two characters when it came to dealing with the zombies. But right here, I mess up my strategy because what I normally do is I burn those two enemies with the match, I burn that guy with the torch, and then I sneak kill that guy while he's in his animation of getting up off the ground. But I unfortunately missed that third guy with my torch, so I wasn't able to sneak kill the fourth guy in time. And that is a thing you can do in the Evil Within series. On the Evil Within series, there are certain animations that you can punish with a sneak kill that you would probably think wouldn't be possible, but they actually are, and it's completely intentional. Because if it wasn't intentional, they would have probably patched it out by now in the Evil Within 2, but they haven't. I mean, I know that in Evil Within 2, they patched out an exploit that I discovered, where you could do sneak kills on enemies as they were climbing down ladders. And I tried doing it after some patches, and it just wasn't working. So they're clearly capable of patching out things like that, but they don't want to patch it out. So I have to give credit to Shinji Mikami and his team for allowing players like me to experiment with the game and just find all these really, really creative strategies like that. And I think it's befitting for a survival horror game to have something like this, because in survival horror you have to look past all the smoke and mirror aspects, you have to not take everything at face value, and you have to look at situations differently compared to a typical action game. So that whole system of punishing preset animations using a sneak kill is my idea of looking past everything at face value and just looking at the situation differently from a survival horror perspective. Yeah, Shinji Mikami is an absolute genius when it comes to survival horror. Being the founder of survival horror, I'm sure he's taken survival horror to new directions at this point. And he's just caused me to look at survival horror differently. And I appreciate him so much for opening my eyes to survival horror greatly. That's why I can understand survival horror aspects better than most people. Like, for instance, in Resident Evil 2 Remake, the zombies on that game are considered scary by so many people because of how they look. But if you're gonna judge an enemy type's scariness based on how they look, that's just dwelling on ignorance. There's more to judging an enemy type than just simply basing it on their looks. You have to look at how this enemy type functions. You have to look at how this enemy type tracks you down. You have to look at how they just smile through your attacks and just hyper armor through your shots. And you just have to look at all the different things that just allow the enemy types to gain artificial handicaps to just feign lethality. And if you have seen my walkthrough of Resident Evil 2 Remake, or you've seen my live streams of Resident Evil 2 Remake, you have seen some of the bullcrap things that the zombies can do. And the zombies on that game cheat a lot just to feign lethality, and that's why I just can't consider them a scary enemy. Oh, by the way, right there, if you get spotted by a haunted before entering this house, it will cause additional enemies to spawn, and these additional enemies are not in the house normally. When you decide to stealth into the house, they are not there, but if you get detected outside the house, they will spawn in, and I'm just like, screw it, I don't really need anything in there. The only thing I ever get from that house is just a trap part, but I can get more trap parts from just playing the game and just doing that little trick I discovered in Chapter 7. So I just choose to leave this whole entire section. And that whole area there is just an optional area. There's no point in going to it. I mean, there is a locker key, but of course I'm not using locker keys in this walkthrough. So this is the ending of Chapter 2 right here. And all we have to do now is just sneak by a bunch of enemies feasting on corpses and make our way to the gate. And you don't have to sneak by them. I just choose to do it because I think it's just the kind of thing Sebastian would do. But if you get detected by these enemies, they spawn infinitely. But you can use that infinite spawning of the enemies to get some trophies.
That's right.
A trophy that absolutely benefits from the infinite spawning of these enemies is the trophy where you have to kill 5 enemies with each type of Agony Crossbow Bolt. I used this section to get that trophy, and I did it incredibly fast. But once we make our way over here, just run. I get spotted by the enemies before I even get a chance to get to the bridge, but it doesn't matter. But that is the end of Chapter 2. Stay tuned for the future chapters. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.